I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving hysterical naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angle-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night. With this, his most famous poem explodes into existence. A social commentary, a cry of frustration, an exercise in catharsis, a reflection of the present and the past. His poem Howl is all of that and more. Allen Ginsberg would go down in history respected and recognized for his unconventional style of poetry, as well as his unwillingness to play by the pre-established rules. He was, and still is, one of the most important members of the Beat Poets, and one who deserves a deeper look. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, poems, and venturing outside the parameters. I'm your host, Jason Lemore Harden. Join us as we dive back into the impactful world of poetry, this time with Allen Ginsberg and his legendary poem, Howl. Quote, "Poetry is not an expression of the party line. It's that time of night, lying in bed, thinking what you really think, making the private world public. That's what the poet does." End quote. Allen Ginsberg was born in Newark, New Jersey on June 3, 1926 as the son of Louis and Naomi Ginsberg, two Jewish members of the New York literary counterculture of the 1920s. He grew up, however, in Paterson, New Jersey. Now, having quote-unquote alternative parents, Ginsberg grew up with various progressive political ideas and perspectives, not least through his mother, whose mental health was a concern throughout his childhood. She would ultimately stay confined for years in a mental hospital, which would later inspire the mournful poem, Kaddish. In his teenage years, Ginsberg read voraciously. He savored Walt Whitman's writings in particular. Then, in 1939, at age 13, his taste took a turn for the Gothic and macabre, Edgar Allan Poe becoming his favorite poet. He would then attend Columbia University, where his anarchical thoughts and political activism would often land him in trouble with the law. Around this same time, he became friends with Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, who would inspire, challenge, and motivate his writings. Living the college life wouldn't last long, however, as he was expelled from Columbia in 1948, in part because he wrote obscenities in his dirty dorm window. He suspected the cleaning woman of being an anti-Semite because she never cleaned his window, so he felt the desire to express this feeling in explicit terms on his window by writing, "Fuck the Jews," and drawing a swastika along with it. He also wrote a phrase on the window implying that the president of the university had no balls. Well, goodbye, Columbia. Following his stint at the university, he traveled widely, working a number of jobs: cafeteria worker, floor mopper, market researcher. In the midst of all of this, he found time to write poetry in his spare time. Then, luckily, for future admirers of his work, there would come a major turning point. Quote, "I began typing not with the idea of writing a formal poem, but stating my imaginative sympathies, whatever they were worth. As my loves were impractical and my thoughts relatively unworldly, I had nothing to gain, only the pleasure of enjoying on paper those sympathies most intimate to myself and most awkward in the great world of my family, formal education, business, and current literature." End quote. The first sparks of what would become the poem Howl, also known as Howl for Carl Solomon, would arrive in 1954. The muse would strike in the apartment he was renting at 1010 Montgomery Street in the North Beach neighborhood of San Francisco. There he was, one afternoon in August. He sat down by his second-hand typewriter with the simple thought of writing whatever came to mind. A recent criticism of his work was still fresh in his mind, and he agreed with the criticism that his poetry was too formal and too tight. So, with this in mind, he tried to write something more loose, something closer to prose than poetry, something that would allow him more freedom. The objective was to write whatever he wanted, whatever came to mind, without fear. He would let his imagination run rampant, open the door to the secrecies within him, and scribble magic lines from his deeper, true mind. He wanted to write something that summed up his life at the time, something so honest and true he wouldn't be able to show others, something that would be written solely for his soul's ear and a few other chosen golden ears. The working title at the time was Strophes. Well, as the day gave way to the afternoon and the sun filled the room, he continued to feed more paper into his big black office typewriter. He wrote using the rhythms of speech from the American streets, Black and Latino speech, frankly speaking. Phrasings overheard on street corners and in bars. He also applied the rhythms of bebop and jazz, sports commentators, even the cool cat DJs on the all-night jazz radio shows. It was precisely this new rhythm and new language that would make his poem stand out. Of this, Ginsberg said that it was a tragic custard pie comedy of wild phrasing, meaningless images for the beauty of abstract poetry of mind, running along making awkward combinations of images like Charlie Chaplin's walk, long saxophone line, chorus lines. In essence, he felt it was a new type of poetry, but it still needed work. By October 1954, he was living with his then-girlfriend, Sheila Williams, in a Nob Hill apartment. It was there, on the evening of October 17th, that he took a hit of the powerful hallucinogen, peyote, which would lead to a terrifying vision, one that would be the principal inspiration for his masterpiece to be. The vision, as it were, would be of the facade of the Sir Francis Drake Hotel in San Francisco turned into the monstrous face of a child-eating demon amidst the trademark Frisco fog. He took notes of the vision and would use these as the base for the second part of his poem. Now it remains unknown whether he took notes while under the influence or afterwards. Then, the following year, on September 1st, 1955, he moved into a small cottage in Berkeley and would frequent a coffee house called Cafe Mediterranean, a few blocks from the campus of the University of California, continuing to write more drafts of the poem. In the first part of the poem, he wrote of Ruth Goldenberg, one of the three graces from the San Remo, who talked continuously 72 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue to museum to Long Island to the Brooklyn Bridge. He wrote of Peter du Peru. He wrote of Neil Cassady, who was very much on his mind and who was also the secret hero of several of his poems, as well as Jack Kerouac's poems. However, he only made vague references to his oldest friends, Kerouac and William Burroughs. Now, since they had not been destroyed by madness, they didn't really fit into the world of the poem. Their stories lacked the raw power of Carl Solomon, a friend Ginsberg had made in a mental facility and who had endured shock treatment. They also lacked the rawness of fellow poet and writer Herbert Huncke's despair, or even the saga of poet and critic Lewis Simpson, who in Howl, quote, threw their watches out of the windows in the ballad of eternity. Recalling the stories of the best minds of his generation, he paraphrased incidents from his own life. From his expulsion from Columbia University, quote, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, to Neil Cassady passing through the U.S., quote, who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston, seeking jazz or soup, and ate candy for 6 days and followed the brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task. Also, there was the part-time cleaning job he had taken to supplement his unemployment money, quote, who mopped all night in desolate Bickfords, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox. He wrote with passion and ferocity until he had about 7 pages of prose poetry, and then discovered that the theme he kept returning to was the story of Carl Solomon. Recognizing that the poem was about Carl, he began a second section, specifically addressed to him. So with a pink editing pencil, he wrote across the top of the page, "Howl" for Carl Solomon. Now, as he later described it, it was, quote, "a lament for the lamb in America, with instances of remarkable lamb-like youths." He bundled together the first 6 pages of the manuscript and sent them off to Jack Kerouac, who was at the time in Mexico City. The 7th page of the manuscript was so covered with scribbling, some sections crossed out altogether, and was so messy that he did not think Kerouac would be able to make any sense of it. Kerouac, instead of recognizing the great breakthrough that the poem represented for Ginsberg, wrote back telling him that "Howl" for Carl Solomon was very powerful, but that he wanted spontaneity or nothing. Kerouac did not like the edits or the crossed-out words in the poem. He didn't think Ginsberg should be making corrections as he worked, and rather wanted him to stay loyal to his first thoughts, keeping true to the spontaneity. Ginsberg, on his end, misunderstood Kerouac and wrote back, quote, "The pages I sent you of Howl, right title, are the first pages put down, as is. I recopied them and sent you the 100% original draft. There is no pre-existent version. I typed it up as I went along. That's why it's so messy." Ginsberg also misunderstood Kerouac when it came to the title of the poem. Jack was not suggesting a title for the poem at all. He was actually quoting the title Ginsberg had already given him, but Ginsberg had clearly forgotten that he had titled the poem before sending it to Jack, because from then on, he always believed that Jack had suggested the title Howl to him. He even thanked him for it on the poem's dedication page. He would find out, though, that he had come up with the title himself some decades later, but by then, one can assume he didn't feel the necessity to make any corrections on the topic. The word Moloch came to Ginsberg while riding on a San Francisco cable car. He mulled over it until he was seated in a cafeteria where he wrote the opening stanzas of the second part of Howl. Continuing in the same vein as Part 1, he opened it with a reference to William Canastra's death. William Canastra, like Neal Cassady, had been a figure character in the Beat Generation scene that Ginsberg was a part of. Although, like Cassady, Canastra had not done any writing, he instead inspired many others' writings. Well, after that section, Ginsberg changed his direction, becoming less specific in his metaphors, writing, quote, "Children, children, the very children breaking their backs under the subways, breaking their backs trying to lift the whole city on their backs, pavements, buildings, trees, Rockefeller Center tons." In the end, Part 2 would go through 19 drafts before he was done shaping it. Concerning Part 3, Ginsberg would later tell how the rhythmic paradigm for the part was conceived and have written the same day as the first part of Howl, which he would later go back to and fill it out, though it would not be completed until after a few live readings of the first parts of the poem. Ginsberg then went through the manuscript of the first section, labeling the lines that belonged together, A, B, C, or D. Those about Neal Cassady were A, those about Carl Solomon were B, and so on. He also made a few vital tonal changes to the text, such as changing mystical to hysterical in the first line, then retyped the lines in their new order so that the poem now led up to the long climactic passage of Carl Solomon in the madhouse. He later stated that the sympathy for Carl Solomon throughout the poem was connected to the bottled-up guilt and sympathy for his mother's schizophrenia, for which she was lobotomized during her stay in a mental institution. This was an issue he was not yet ready to address directly at the time. The poem would be performed for the first time at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco on October 7, 1955. Allen had originally intended to read the poem for the performance. The reading had been conceived by Wally Hedrick, an artist and co-founder of the Sixth Gallery. Wally approached Allen in mid-1955 and asked him to organize a poetry reading. To begin with, Allen refused, but once he'd written a rough draft of Howl and realized that he had something unique, he had a change of heart. The earliest recording of Howl was thought to date March 18, 1956. The Blackburn collection recordings, however, show otherwise. It is, nevertheless, an impressive performance, one that took place after Ginsberg and fellow poet Gary Snyder traveled to the Anna Mann Dormitory at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, by hitchhiking all the way from San Francisco. This recording, discovered in mid-2007 on a reel-to-reel tape in the Reed College archives, contains only part 1 of Howl, since after beginning to read part 2, he stops and tells the audience that he doesn't feel like reading anymore on account of running out of steam. With a lack of steam, or not, after the very successful reading and likely inspired to keep working on it, he forged ahead to do some more edits on part 3. Part 3 has a fixed base in the phrase, quote, "I'm with you in Rockland." This is followed by a longer response, practically made for reading aloud, which makes sense since he still had the live performances fresh in his mind when writing part 3. He took the form of this section from 18th century English poet Christopher Smart and his poem Jubilate Agno. Allen had read the poem in the early 1940s, and it obviously stuck with him. You see, each line of Smart's poem is a statement opening with the word let, followed by a counterstatement. Similarly, Allen used, quote, "I'm with you in Rockland" as the statement and opened his counterstatement with where, as in, quote, "I'm with you in Rockland, where there are 25,000 mad comrades all together singing the final stanzas of the Internationale. I'm with you in Rockland, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bed sheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep." The final section of the poem is called Footnote to Howl, rather than Howl Part 4, as it is a variation of Part 2. He would later say that he remembered coming up with the archetypal rhythm of the repeated word, holy, while weeping in a bus on Kearney Street, and wrote most of the part down in a notebook then and there. After some polishing, the poem was complete. Prior to Howl, he had for some time been in negotiations with City Lights Publishing in relation to his book of early poems called Empty Mirror. Unfortunately for him, City Lights was not interested in Empty Mirror at the time, though it would be published in 1961. However, when he showed the head of City Lights, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Howl, he was impressed and agreed to publish it. Following the meeting, Ginsberg wrote Kerouac about the deal. Since Howl tackled stories relating to Ginsberg's friends and contemporaries, its tumbling, hallucinatory style, and the frank address of sexuality, specifically homosexuality, it subsequently provoked an obscenity trial. Seeing as Howl contains many references to illicit drugs as well as both hetero and homosexual acts, it received its fair share of controversy upon its release on November 1, 1956. On March 25, 1957, 520 copies of the poem were seized by customs officials when being imported from England on the basis that it was obscene. In June later that year, Shig Morao, a bookstore manager, was arrested and jailed for selling Ginsberg's book Howl and other poems to an undercover San Francisco police officer. Subsequently, City Lights publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti was arrested for publishing the book. At the obscenity trial, which would be depicted in the 2010 movie Howl starring James Franco, 9 literary experts testified on the poem's behalf. Supported by the American Civil Liberties Union, Ferlinghetti won the case after the California State Superior Court concluded that the poem was of some redeeming social importance. The case was widely publicized, with articles appearing in both Time and Life magazines. An account of the trial was published by Ferlinghetti's lead defense attorney, Jake Ehrlich, in a book called Howl of the Censor. Much has changed in the following 66 years, and Howl is today considered a classic. It is one of those pieces of writing that demonstrate the importance of exercising one's right to freedom of speech, even if it's combated, and maybe especially then. First met with fear and obscenity charges, it is now rightfully recognized for its creativity and innovation. Now, Let's conclude this episode with a quote from the radical poet himself, this one on advice to other writers. To write secretly, to write for nobody's eye and nobody's ear, but your own, so you can actually be free to say anything you want. In other words, it means abandoning being a poet, abandoning any careerism, abandoning the idea of even writing poetry, really abandoning, giving up as hopeless, abandoning the possibility of really expressing yourself to the nations of the world, abandoning the idea of being a prophet with honor and dignity, and abandoning the glory of poetry and just settling down in the muck of your own mind. And the way that's practiced is you take it out a week later and you look at it, and it's no longer embarrassing. It seems by that time funny. The blood has dried, sort of. But you really have to make a resolution to write just for yourself, but really for yourself, in the sense of no bullshit to impress others, in a sense, not writing poetry to impress yourself, but just writing what yourself is saying. My own experience of Howl was precisely that after writing some very formulistic poetry, I decided I'd let loose whatever I wanted to let loose with and say what I really had on my mind and not write a poem. Finally, break my own forms, break my own ideals of what I was supposed to be like as a poet, and just write whatever I had in mind. End quote. That was a mouthful. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I've been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can subscribe and encourage others to subscribe to our YouTube page, House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.